Good afternoon, everybody. No mai, haere mai. Welcome to the session today, which will address environmentally harmful agricultural subsidies through the multilateral trading system. Apologies for my stuttering. I'm Claire Kelly, New Zealand's ambassador to the WTO, and I have the honour to be co-hosting this session with my esteemed colleague, Ambassador James Baxter of Australia. And we will hear from 4 expert panelists today who will take the floor to share their perspectives on the environmental impact of agricultural support, the consequences for global sustainable agriculture, and the potential role of the trading system therein. Joining us are to my left, Martin von Lamp, Head of the Policy Monitoring and Evaluation Unit of the OECD's Trade and Agriculture Directorate. Next to him, Antonine Vergez, a senior expert for natural resources from the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, who will build on this and speak to the biodiversity impacts of these subsidies and the opportunities reform brings for nature-based solutions. In turning to my right, we have Malaku Desta from the African Trade Policy Centre of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, who will share African perspectives on the environmental impacts of subsidies. And finally, we have Dr. Caroline Dier-Burbeck, Executive Director of the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs, the TESS, who will contextualize these presentations from a trade perspective and offer us some ideas on how to move forward. Now, before I hand over to the experts, I want to make a few scene-setting remarks. It will come to no surprise to many people here that New Zealand is co-hosting a panel on agricultural subsidies today. And this is because we are a long-time true believer in agricultural subsidy reform. This position is based first and foremost in our experience following the removal of all New Zealand's producer support in the early 1980s. These changes came at a time of economic crisis in New Zealand, when production in what was and still is one of our major industries had become so disconnected from market signals that urgent action was needed. However, with the beauty of hindsight and huge developments in science and technology, we can also now reflect on the impact of these subsidies from an environmental perspective. Not only did removing production payments limit negative consequences for the environment, such as biodiversity loss resulting from land conversion and overproduction of livestock, but we can now see that these payments were coming with an opportunity cost. Without them, producers were incentivized to innovate and improve practices for the benefit not just of production efficiency, but also the environment and overall resilience. This is, of course, the isolated experience of one small economy, but we all know that the numbers around total agricultural subsidies are immense and are continuing to grow. And no matter how far New Zealand may be from the rest of the world, we want to share our experience and benefits we've accrued from it with other WTO members. It's becoming increasingly clear that the current subsidy regime in agriculture is out of step, not only with trade reform, but with the urgent global climate and sustainability imperative. I recall in particular the target recently agreed as part of the Global Biodiversity Framework to reduce environmentally harmful subsidies by 2030 in a proportionate, just, fair, effective and equitable way. And this is what we want to explore today. How does agricultural subsidy reform enable greater resilience of global agri-food systems? What do we already know about the impact of agricultural subsidies on the environment? What are the challenges to moving forward in the multilateral trading system? And critically, what do we stand to gain from progress, both for the environment and for global food security? These are big questions, but not new ones. And we're very lucky to be joined today by some of the key people and organizations who are delving into these issues. Now, I'll invite each speaker to take the floor one by one. Once all the speakers have presented, I will pass over to Ambassador Baxter to moderate a Q&A session, so please hold your questions until that point. Our session is being live webcast to those not able to join in person today, and all presentations will be made available following this session. Without further ado, let me introduce in more detail Martin von Lamp from the OECD's Trade and Agricultural Directorate. Martin will take us through the OECD's evidence base on the drivers of environmental impacts related to agricultural subsidies and give us some insights into the challenges and opportunities measuring economic measures from an environmental perspective. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, we can have that. What I'll try to do is really to give a bit of a picture of where we are, what we know, what we don't know, and maybe starting by just briefly talking about the kind of spectrum of different work that we do at OECD with the different teams that we have in our directorate and elsewhere, that are all related to the questions that we have here on the table. So on the one hand side, we're obviously monitoring what's happening, and monitoring means we're looking at how the environmental state changes in terms of agri-environmental indicators. We cover a fair number of countries with a large set of environmental indicators. And then equally important, we also measure what we call agricultural support. So we look at agricultural policies and measure the transfers that are implied. And we do that again for a fairly large chunk of countries, which cover about 3/4 of global agricultural value added. We have a long time series for that, and we obviously try to break down the different types of support into elements that we can then use for analysis. We also do reviews. We look into individual countries and obviously collect much more evidence in depth there. And we also look at what's out there in terms of scientific literature. And finally, we do all kinds of analytical work ourselves in terms of economic modeling, but also we use other empirical methods to do so. Let me quickly give you an overview on this agricultural policy monitoring and evaluation and the data that comes out of that. It's an annual report providing a qualitative description of support of policies, but also a quantitative estimate of public support to agriculture, both for producers, but also for consumers. And then we look at general services which basically benefit the sector overall. I mentioned the number of countries before, but just to give you a bit of a flavor of the order of magnitude that we're talking about, between 2020 and 2022, the amount of support that was transferred to the agricultural sector amounted to more than $850 billion, right? So that's basically support that comes in all kinds of different ways, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But it's also worth noting that we really go into the details of individual policies, and we inventory quite a number of different measures in our database. Let's see if, here we go. So when we measure support, we basically break it down by implementation. So we don't look as much at the question of what are these policies supposed to achieve, but we look at how are they implemented, what kind of criteria need to be fulfilled in order to actually make the farmer eligible to receive that payment. And that's important if you want to understand what the implications of that support is. And so when you look at this, you see basically on the left-hand side, the market price support, which is quite important, and about a third, a bit more than a third of support that goes to OECD farmers. And then all kinds of budgetary support that goes to farmers as well. And it's worth pointing the fact out that we also measure market price support, because most of you dealing with WTO here probably will wonder, what has market access to do with domestic support? We measure everything into our support estimate. And so that's quite important to be borne in mind when we discuss reform options and also the effects of those different policy elements. You see here essentially that there is a different range of payments that we cover that have different implications for trade in the first place. So we look at basically payments that we consider most trade distortive, or potentially so, which includes market price support, but also a certain number of payments related to output or related to variable input use. And then you have basically payments that are a little more or much more decoupled from the direct production itself. And then you have what we call policies that are really decoupled from the current production decision, which is basically payments often related to historical data. And then last but not least, and at the top, you have basically payments that are related to something that the farmer produces that is not agricultural output, but is non-commodity output. So that can basically include, for instance, environmental outputs such as biotopes or hedges and things like that. So that's quite important to be borne in mind. What's important is also that basically there is a fair number of measures where we consider them potentially harmful to the environment. That certainly includes output-based payments and also payments based on the unconstrained use of variable inputs. And it's really important to note that basically some of those payments that you see otherwise can be made environmentally a bit more friendly or less harmful if you basically attach them to constraints. So we also look at the type of environmental constraints farmers need to fulfill, certain practices that they have to do, or certain things that they must not do in order to be eligible to receive that payment. The analysis that I was talking about that basically identifies those payments as most environmentally harmful or potentially so also includes market price support. But it's important to note that in that case, we looked at local and national environmental impacts only. So this is very different from global effects such as greenhouse gas emissions or also biodiversity effects. And I'll come to talk about that in a minute. So finally, or almost finally, it's really important to note a couple of really complex issues that we're trying to tackle with the work that we're currently doing. First, the point that I was just making in terms of differentiating between local and national environmental impacts on the one hand side and global ones on the other hand. This is really important because basically as soon as you have repercussions through the international markets, then your local impact may be different from what you measure at the global scale. And of course, when you have global commons such as the greenhouse gas emissions and the climate change, then you have to take that into account. And there is literature out there that finds different directions of impacts, for instance, coming from market price support. So that's policies that basically increase domestic prices over world prices. And overall, we find that basically that impact on global emissions may be ambivalent, could be a little bit either way. Probably it's relatively small. Second, there's also basically the fact that there is an increasingly complex landscape of environmentally motivated policies. And that's quite important because also those specific requirements that basically are put to recipients really make a very detailed analysis necessary. And we're not quite there yet in being able to analyze each and every one of those. There are a couple of methodological issues related to this analysis that still need to be solved on our side. One question is, for instance, what exactly do you compare a measure to? What's the baseline? Do you compare it to a no policy or do you compare it to an alternative policy? And if so, which one would that be? How do we account for the diversity of environmental impacts, right? You may have trade-offs, you may have synergies. Just think of animal welfare measures that may, extensify beef farming on grassland, which may have negative impacts on climate change, right? So you have to deal with those somehow, and that, of course, has also implications for the analysis. How to assess the degree of additionality. You really want to make sure that basically your measure adds to what farmers would otherwise be doing. And then also to look into local conditions, specific implementation details that will also likely affect the policies. And finally, I'm almost there. We obviously continue to invest in collecting, structuring, and publishing this kind of policy information that I was talking about in the beginning of my presentation. We also work towards increasingly detailed representation of some of those implementation detail that are relevant for the environmental impacts or deemed to be relevant for those. we develop and expand and apply our tools for analyzing the impacts. I was already talking about modeling, but we're also engaged in other more empirical methods. And then what's quite important also is, and that's why I also appreciate to be here, is that we're very much into a collaboration and exchange. It's extremely important that in this debate, we don't do these kind of analysis and discussions in silos, but we talk to each other. And OECD is really committed to basically provide a forum just like this one is as well. We are strong believers in really both the need to reform, but also to make sure that those reforms go in the right direction and are really meaningful. And so obviously, it's quite important that also all our information is, of course, publicly available, and you're obviously welcome to access it on the website that is indicated here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin, for starting us off with such a comprehensive overview of the environmental impacts of subsidies from the OECD's perspective, and also the complexities of defining an environmentally harmful or beneficial subsidy. Also for reminding us of how important it is to keep working on this issue. I will now turn to Antonine Vergés. Antonine joins us from IUCN and will be able to add to this picture by exploring the biodiversity elements of agricultural subsidies in more depth, which is very timely work given the recent commitment under the Global Biodiversity Framework I mentioned in my introduction.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to hear from you and collaborate and exchange ideas. So I will present a recent work that we have done at IUCN, so the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. There I work within the economy and finance team with IUCN chief economist, Juha Sikamaki, who is one of the co-authors of this report. So it's been a collaborative and internal work. So we've called it Agricultural Subsidies, Biodiversity and Trade, Examining Connections to Repurposing Support. This work was co-funded by Australian Permanent Mission at WTO and French Development Agency. Our approach was first to dig into the existing data about agricultural support. So we've tried to understand the crosswalks between WTO typology, OECD typology, and ag incentives typologies. Ag incentives is the data source we've used in the end. It's to our knowledge, the most comprehensive because it encompasses more countries than the list of OECD countries, up to 79 countries. So we decided to use these databases, data from 2016, 2018, and we've understood the crossroads between the OECD producer support estimate and the data we have on agricultural support, different types of agricultural supports in the ag incentive database that is maintained by FAO, OECD, the IDB, IFPRI, and World Bank. We've also tried to correlate these data. We did not make any modeling nor causal methods. We only applied like correlation analysis, comparing data from different sources. So we tried to analyze the correlation between these data on agricultural support per type and the level of each type with what we've called an ecosystem impact. And to proxy this impact, we used agricultural land using FAO stat data, FAO data. And one of the originality of this work is that we have mobilized the unique data from IUCN coming from the red list. I'm sure you've heard one time at least about the data from the red list, species that are critically endangered, vulnerable, nearly threatened, etc. So we've mobilized this data and tried to correlate it with the level and type of agricultural support at country level, but encompassing as many countries as possible. So our scope was, and we also combined this data with data on trade flows between countries to calculate what we've called a country spatial agricultural footprint, agricultural support footprint of countries. scope was nearly global, 79 countries. We've done the analysis at global levels for some countries and for some crops that here appear as sectoral assessments. It is worth noting that the data for livestock has been separated because it is very difficult to allocate all the agricultural support to specific land use because you don't know whether maize or corn is dedicated to livestock or not. So we've mostly used data for crops. So the approach was only pure correlation analysis, as said earlier. These are basic facts, and I will not present them. It's about the same thing Martin has presented just before. Different size of different types of agricultural support using the ag incentives data. So you can have subsidies to the output, to the input use. You can have, so these are coupled transfers. You can have market support in the forms of tariff at the border. You can also have decoupled transfers to producers and other types of supports to incentivize the co-production of public goods, for example, green subsidies, so belonging to this even more complex of landscape of environmentally motivated agricultural support, and some support targeted at consumer. The next slide doesn't want to come. So this is only, we discovered the importance of what we call negative subsidies. Prior to this analysis, we thought agricultural support, there are only positive support for producers, but you have several countries in which the domestic price is lower than the international reference price. It corresponds to a sort of tax that is applied by the government to the agricultural sector. On the left-hand side, you have the total agricultural support per country that is broken down according to the type of support. And on the left-hand side, this is the same size for each bar, but the breaking down is different. It is a breaking down according to whether it's crops that are supported, livestock, or whether the support is non-allocated. You will find these slides. I have understand this slide. The slide will be shared. So just to insist on what surprised us is the quite numerous countries having negative support at national level. Okay, so at global level, then we correlate this data on agricultural support with the data on land coming from FAO to assess the share of croplands that are positively versus negatively supported at global level, at per region and per countries that were gathered according to their income level. So I'm sorry, it is not possible to see this, but then we've tried to calculate for each country a sort of agricultural support footprint by allocating the agricultural support that will incentivize the production of agricultural commodities that will be domestically consumed. We have added agricultural support of imported agricultural commodities that are supported elsewhere in the production countries. And we have below the zero axis, in orange, we have the agricultural support corresponding to agricultural area, croplands that are positively subsidized, but contribute to exports of country. It is the idea of a footprint. You may know about carbon footprint, etc. That's the same idea. So we add the domestic support plus the imported support minus the export support. This is only an example of work we've done. And this is another original result. This is one of my last slides. So we mobilized the data coming from the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, the most authoritative, comprehensive database on species, whether they are threatened of extinction or not at global level. More than 150,000 species have been assessed. So far, it is a continuously updated data. So on these two maps, you see the top one, you see the number of species that are threatened by agriculture. In this database, you can distinguish between types of threats. So we have only spotted the species threatened by agriculture. And you have at the bottom, on the bottom map, the percentage of species that are threatened by agriculture. So the share of all the threatened species in one country that are threatened by agriculture. And then we did a simple correlation analysis. So differentiating between countries, so these are the blue dots that are negatively supporting their agriculture, from the countries that are positively supporting their agriculture, the red dots. And you have two graphs. One, we correlated this with the number of species that are threatened by agriculture. This is the upper part of this slide. And we correlated the same data on total level of agricultural support per country, per hectare actually, with the share of species that are threatened by agriculture. This is the bottom part of this slide. These are only examples of results that we have had in this analysis, and we are very grateful for the support we received. And we may convert this report into an IUCN publication in the coming months. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Antonine, for that fascinating presentation. And it's clear that IUCN will have a very important role to play in generating that sound evidence base on biodiversity metrics to underpin progress. And now that we've explored the technical element of environmentally harmful agricultural subsidies, it's time to discuss the practicalities. And this brings us to Melaku Desta. Melaku brings a wealth of experience to this discussion via the African Trade Policy Centre. And I'll turn to him to help us contextualize what this might mean for African agriculture and the African perspective on sustainable agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I think the data that has been shared is very revealing. The amount of money that's being spent on agriculture seems to be going up rather than down over the years. Traditionally, as we all know, the issue of agricultural subsidies has been discussed or approached from the perspectives of trade and production distortion, from the issue of equity, and then fairness, and then perspectives like that. The agreement on agriculture was itself, I think, the product of that effort to address or to bring agricultural subsidies under some kind of control. If you look at the agreement, I think you will agree with me that I think it's only two provisions out of the whole agreement that deal with market access issues. Everything is about domestic support and export subsidy issues. And even then, those market access issues came in because of as a kind of ancillary tool to take care of the excesses coming out of the domestic support mechanisms and then the export subsidies that resulted from that. So we have always known that agriculture has had significant developmental issues, and especially in Africa, this has been considered as a big, very detrimental policy tool that made competition for African farmers impossible on the global market. And in fact, in the last in the presentation from IUCN, I think you introduced the idea of the negative subsidies. And we have always been saying that in many of our countries, it is the tax-paying farmers who are competing with the subsidized farmers on the international market. So that's, I think, what's coming out clearly. I was, in fact, surprised to see some countries not on the negative one, but on the positive one. To see a country like mine, Ethiopia, for example, or Burkina Faso having positive subsidies, that surprised me, I have to say, because I know the farmers there, as a son of a farmer, I can tell you, are taxed rather than subsidized. So, and that's why I think many of us put a lot of hope in the Doha process with its title as the Doha Development Agenda, but that did not produce what we're hoping. And now we're talking about the environmental aspect of the environmental damage caused by this same subsidies, I think. And I cannot, I think the presentations have shown, but I cannot claim to have exhaustively reviewed the literature, but from what I have seen, it looks to me that by and large, those trade and production distortive subsidies seem also to be environmentally harmful subsidies. So I think we are introducing a new tool with which to address the same old problems. In the continent in Africa, as I mentioned earlier, the challenge has always been our inability to support the farmers in the most basic ways, even in providing extension services and things like that, in ensuring peace and stability in the countryside, in making sure that there are basic infrastructure connectivity possibilities for the farmers. Since 2003, we introduced at the continental level what we call the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program, CAADP, in which, very interestingly, rather than talking about how to remove subsidies, we're talking about introducing support to the farmer, to agriculture. There was a target of spending 10% of national budgets under the CAADP program for each country to spend a minimum of 10% of their budget to support agriculture. The driving, the driver being, of course, the issue of food security. And about 10 years later, in 2013, 14, we reviewed, and not many countries had actually met that target. So we had what we call the Malabo declaration, which reviewed the targets, and then interestingly for our conversation here, we even came up with a target of boosting intra-African trade in agricultural products, in agricultural commodities. And then that was immediately linked to the African continental free trade area, where an effort has been made to fast track the liberalization of agricultural products within the continent, within the free trade area. And even then, I know as a matter of fact that there were several countries who resisted the idea of fast-tracking agricultural liberalization within the continent. So right now, we are talking about another third version of that CAADP program. It's now called, it's not adopted yet, it's called the CAADP Strategy and Action Plan 2026-2035. And then here you will see trade and environmental sustainability coming very clearly together, because the climate change challenges, Africa may not have contributed much to climate change, but it's suffering the worst consequence of climate change. So Africa is also trying to do what it can to address those issues. So my conclusion on these issues is certainly, I think I welcome the focus on looking at the same subsidies, the same trade distorting production, distorting subsidies from an environmental angle, and hopefully that will also give us another opportunity to tackle the same issues from that perspective. My only fear is I'm also as an African, from an African perspective, I would also fear that the same subsidies that are distortive of production and trade might also be rebaptized as an environmentally friendly kind of subsidy, and I'm hoping that there will be no greenwashing of those subsidies, so to speak. So that's where I would conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Malaku. That was a very thought-provoking presentation and helps us better understand the very real impact of agricultural subsidies, including on Africa's agricultural development aspirations. And that brings us to our last expert speaker this afternoon. Many of you already know Dr. Carolyn Deer-Burbeck of TESS, and I will now hand over to her to provide us with some views on how we harness this growing body of evidence and ideas on environmental impacts of agricultural subsidies in the WTO to make some urgently needed progress. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. So we've heard from the speakers so far that there's a range of environmental challenges facing agricultural production and trade, and some of those are very closely associated with subsidies. We've also heard from Melaku the importance of putting these environmental challenges in context of the social and economic issues facing developing countries, whether that's around food and nutrition security, livelihoods and employment concerns, and just the wider sustainable development aspirations that they have. So it's in this context of trying to consider the three pillars of sustainable development, the environment, the social, and the economic, that I'm going to try and focus on how we might approach this topic of environmentally harmful ag subsidies in the trading system. And then I'll also try and share some ideas on the importance at the WTO of putting this issue of ag subsidies in the context of a wider discussion about how the trading system can support sustainability in global agriculture. So first, just on an approach to reform of agricultural subsidies, from a political or policy viewpoint, one way that we can achieve that reform is for countries to do so autonomously. They don't need the WTO to tell them what to do. Any country could go forward and do this. So one way we are seeing some progress on this is through efforts in some jurisdictions for countries to repurpose their subsidies. But fostering effective and fair reform of environmentally harmful subsidies, and indeed the issue of repurposing subsidies, really requires cooperative action, not least to ensure that any reductions in environmentally harmful subsidies in one country is not offset by increases in unsustainable production and trade elsewhere. So this is where the trading system comes in, as the idea that we need a cooperative framework for tackling this challenge. Now, from the perspective of international trade cooperation, as many of you here know, trade people love definitions, and they need definitions in order to have a mutual understanding of what they're talking about. So a big challenge is, as you've heard from the other speakers, is how do we come to a shared understanding of what is meant? Now, this is being taken up here in the WTO, but also in the OECD, and the issue is also there in the context of the Global Biodiversity Framework, where Target 18 talks about addressing subsidies harmful to biodiversity in a proportionate, just, fair, and effective way, reducing them by at least 500 billion by the year 2030, starting with the most harmful incentives. So you get back to this question of what are the most harmful incentives and how would we identify those in order to reduce them? So as we've heard from other speakers, there's an emerging recognition that public support linked to production, such as price support, input and output subsidies, are more likely to be environmentally harmful. But we've also heard from the studies that the real world impact of any given type of support is highly context specific and depends on a wide variety of factors. Often there are a number of trade-offs between different environmental and broader public policy objectives. And indeed, most subsidies are simultaneously trying to serve multiple objectives. So just singling out that environmental aspect is quite difficult. So what we need to do is to have much more granular and differentiated approaches to define exactly what environmentally harmful subsidies are. So at TESS, we wanted to complement the kind of work that other colleagues at OECD and IUCN have been doing to see what might be learned from prior efforts at the WTO to handle environmentally harmful subsidies, to see if that might provide us some lessons, because ultimately we need a software here that might work in the trade arena. So we do have one interesting precedent which can provide some inspiration, and that's the WTO Fisheries Subsidies Agreement, where many of these questions about how to define and identify environmentally harmful subsidies have had to be addressed. So just quickly review those. First, in the case of the fish subsidies negotiations, instead of looking at specific forms of subsidies, the negotiators focused on specific fishing practices that should not be incentivized through subsidies, regardless of the type of support. So that included illegal fishing, fishing in the unregulated high seas, or fishing of stocks that are already overfished. So a question is whether such an approach based on production methods or environmentally harmful farming practices could be explored in agriculture to provide that additional granularity. Of course, this will be challenging as well because the practices that are harmful may vary depending on the local conditions, but there may be some that we could agree that in most places would be unwise or harmful environmentally. The second thing in the negotiations, the second phase of the fish agreement, was that they tried to define different types of subsidies deemed to contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. So for fuel, construction, and equipment. And to deal with the fact that the impact tends to be very context specific, like in the case of agriculture, the draft disciplines would allow members to maintain certain subsidies if they demonstrate that they don't have negative environmental impacts. So it's kind of a reversal of the burden of proof. And the third, the fish subsidies negotiations explored a range of context-specific exceptions in the form of special and differential treatment for countries accounting for a negligible share of the problem, so for small-scale or resource-poor producers, or for countries at low levels of economic development. So our effort at TESS, we're undertaking work to try and draw on some of this experience and lessons, building on some of the work the governments and concepts the governments are already familiar with in the trade setting, to think about, to build further understanding of how we might define environmentally harmful subsidies. I regret to say that we don't have the outcome yet, but we have convened a really marvelous group of international experts on agriculture and on trade who are trying to look exactly at how we could frame this discussion in a way that's amenable to future cooperation in the WTO setting. So we hope that report will hopefully be out this autumn. So it's on its way. But we do hope that this can help inform the work that could happen here at the WTO. And that could be in a range of different forms. It could be in terms of new rules or disciplines, but it could also be in terms of enhanced transparency and monitoring, or more soft law approaches in the form of pledges or guidelines in regard to environmentally harmful subsidies. So just if I have a minute, do I have a minute left? Yeah, super, a minute or two. So I just wanted to step back to consider how this issue of environmentally harmful subsidies fits into the wider issue of sustainability in agriculture at the WTO. So one interesting element is that many of the modelling studies so far show that the environmental benefit resulting from the elimination of certain forms of subsidies may come as a result of a decline in production. Now, this would be happening at a time when progress in reducing food security has been reversed, and over 35% of the global population remains unable to afford a healthy diet. So in light of these sort of food and nutrition security challenges, the effort to tackle negative environmental effects of agriculture needs to focus not on reducing production, but on changing the way in which food is produced and traded, on enhancing productivity, on improving affordability and access, and reducing food waste, while reducing the environmental footprint of agriculture production in all of the different dimensions that other speakers have mentioned, and at the same time tackling the climate impact on agricultural sector as well. So in our view, making progress on the issue of environmentally harmful subsidies or repurposing really requires a broader openness to discussion on the sustainability dimension of agriculture in the multilateral trading system. The rules and regulations and disciplines that are there now, we're not aiming to address the sustainability dimension of the agricultural system. And yet we know, for all of the reasons I've already stated, it's central to the future of agriculture and central to the future of agricultural trade. From a social and economic perspective, we know it's critical to livelihoods. Over 800 million people around the world relying on agriculture. We know that there's been a need for it to attend to the issues facing smallholder farmers, MSMEs, Indigenous people. We know we'll need to address issues of unfairness in agricultural supply chains, where some of the producers upstream receive a very small share of the return for products placed on markets. We know there's lots of concentration in agricultural supply chains and among outsized market power of commodity buyers and so on. And we know that many producers in developing countries simply don't have access to the technologies, financing, investment, and partnerships they need in order to invest in this whole sustainability transition. From a nutrition perspective, we know that trade is critical. Low-income countries in particular benefit most from trade. But we also know that there are a lot of challenges. We know that there's an increasing flow of highly processed foods, with low nutritional value across the world. And this is contributing to the spread of non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, and obesity, especially that's a growing burden of disease in developing countries. We also know that the way in which that the food system today relies heavily on a few calorie-dense crops, which are suited to large-scale industrial farming. And this has been incentivized through government support, but it can also be at the expense of dietary diversity and access to nutritious, more nutritious food. And so finally, from a trade perspective, the conversations will need to include a broad range of issues. Subsidies certainly central, but also we'll need to look at regulations, standards, and what kind of international support measures will enable developing countries to improve their productive capacity, while also meeting this extraordinary array of new standards and requirements, voluntary and mandatory. So at the WTO, there's not a single space for this to be discussed. Obviously, there are several avenues, whether horizontally across different WTO bodies or in the context of individual committees, such as the Committee on Agriculture, the special session of the Committee on Agriculture, or the CTE. But regardless of where it takes place, we need it to happen, and we urgently need that discussion to start happening at the WTO in a way that's open and inclusive, involving the work of other agents with expertise like the FAO, the CBD, the WHO, among others. In doing so, we don't need to detract or divert attention from ongoing agricultural negotiations, but we can complement them and contribute to catalyzing a much healthier long-term discussion of the kind of trade system that we need for a more sustainable agricultural system. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, for that brilliant presentation. And we are eagerly awaiting that report and those recommendations on how we make progress. We've now reached the question and answer session part of our panel, and I will hand over to James to take that forward. Thanks very much, James.
Thanks very much to you, Claire, and a big thank you to everyone for coming along to participate in this session, and in particular to our speakers. I think what we have heard is a series of presentations that highlights the relevance of this problem, the immediacy of it, but also illustrates that the discussion is a very nascent one. Now, we've been having negotiations in the WTO on agricultural subsidies for a very long time, but those discussions have, as Malaku pointed out, been focused really on the trade and production distorting aspects of agricultural subsidies, and have been tackled from an equity and fairness angle. I think what we've heard this afternoon is that there are other angles of the discussion that really warrant international attention and consideration. That's something that's increasingly come to be the view of Australia, and I know New Zealand, hence our interest in this session, but the work more broadly. And we really welcome the work that experts around this table and more broadly have been doing. So as Claire mentioned, having heard those presentations, which were in a very nice way quite thought-provoking, we have some time for questions from the audience. So I am happy to open the floor. We'll probably take a few questions at a time. And if I can ask people when they ask a question, if they can begin by introducing themselves. Thank you.
Yes, Ronald Steenblick from the Quaker United Nations office. A very interesting presentation, very interesting session. I have I guess comments or reactions anyway to some of the things that Carolyn Deere-Birkbeck said. She said about all the other kind of objectives of policies make identifying environmentally harmful agricultural subsidies difficult. But I'm a little bit curious about that, because it makes deciding which ones to prioritize for reform difficult. But can't one at least make a ranking of the environmental effects of the subsidies, irrespective of the other objectives? That's one. Second is, I'm always a little bit nervous when I hear about repurposing any kinds of these subsidies, because it tends to feed into or be informed by an attitude as if there's this pot of money for agriculture, there's this pot of money for energy, or a pot of money for fish. And it may be that that actually agriculture in aggregate needs more money than what's being currently provided, or less money. And it also, I think we need to think of if we're talking about security, it doesn't necessarily depend on supply. It could also be augmented by other things like better ways of storing, better refrigeration, better transport, better stockpiles. I would just throw these out as a couple of things to consider when we enter this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So just before we go on to the next question, Carolyn, you might want to have first question was posed to you. So, but I might also seek comments from both Anton and Martin, and then the second question, I think a lot in that for you, perhaps, Malaku. But if we can go to the gentleman there, and then the woman down near the door. Thanks.
Thank you. It's a really nice presentation. And my name is Sachin, and I'm from India. And my specific question to Martin and Tronin, and the specific question is that one of the reasons for negative market support, total support, was the negative market price support. And my specific question is, what steps concerned countries need to be taken to address negative support? One of the reasons maybe some countries are imposing export restriction. That's why the farmers' income is going decline. Is there any other factors which lead to the negative market price support under the OECD methodology? Second, one of the issues in WTO agriculture negotiation is updating the external reference price. The way the market price support being calculated under the OECD and under the WTO is very different. Whereas OECD take dynamic reference price, whereas under the WTO we take 90, 86, 88 prices. Do you think that they need to update the external reference price under the WTO? And the last one clarification to Anthony, one of the figure you have mentioned about threat to species or diversity and total agricultures or agriculture subsidies. Whether agriculture subsidy means total agriculture subsidy or some kind of subsidy you have taken into account. That's the clarification. Thank you.
Thank you. So just on those, Martin, you might want to take the first, but Malaku might also have questions on that one. I might have some comments on that, and then the second and third one's largely for you two. And Caroline, I don't know whether you have anything on any of those. Okay, next question down.
Yeah, thank you very much for a brilliant panel. My name is Elisabeth Bürgi. I'm from the University of Bern, Switzerland. I have a question with regards to the trade-offs that have been mentioned. As has been very nicely shown, it's very difficult to say which part of a subsidy is environmental friendly and which part is unfriendly. So I'm coming from a country with lots of environmental friendly subsidies, but the outcome is very environmentally unfriendly. We have a very bad biodiversity record, unclosed nutrition cycles, etc. So I'm also co-leading a project on it's called Agreement on Agriculture Reimagined. We are thinking of how would an agreement on agriculture look like if we did it from scratch, so taking into account sustainability goals, etc. So by doing so, it's quite a tricky exercise. We think of whether a more comprehensive approach would be needed, like, for example, mentioned by Colin Deere, to look at farming practices, or whether we should even go a step further and think of if countries, for example, would need to align their national adaptation strategies in climate change with a strategy to go towards sustainable, diversified food systems. And whether we then would think of all the trade measures and the policy measures used in order to support agriculture, etc., aligned with that strategy. We could rather argue these are okay, then if they applied in an efficient way, or whether, but if they kind of have a negative effect on that strategy, that pathway towards more diversified food system, it would rather be a damaging subsidy. So my question to you would be that such a more comprehensive approach, would that make sense maybe in order to better tackle the trade-offs within that question you're dealing with?
Thank you. That is an excellent question. It really overhangs the whole discussion. So I might give everyone an opportunity to chip in response to that. But perhaps if we can draw a line under the first round of questions then and go back to the first one, which was about the sort of the ranking of different types of subsidies. And I think, Carolyn, did you have anything that you wanted to say in particular on that one?
Sure. Just quickly, I appreciate the question, Ron. I think that there are two different issues that we're discussing. One is how to identify those that are environmentally harmful. And then a second issue is how would one prioritize different competing public policy objectives around them. So I was focusing more on the identifying, and I think it is difficult to assess. What we've heard from our colleagues from OECD and IUCN is that it is quite difficult to assess ex ante the impact of those subsidies and to differentiate, because some kinds of support may have positive and negative impacts. It could be positive for animal welfare or for biodiversity, but have a terrible GHG emission impact, or it could be terrible for water tables, or for, you could use all kinds of fertilizers that have a terrible long-term impact on health or on soil productivity. So there's a multitude of environmental harms that one might be trying to assess. So that's what I was sort of getting at with that. And if I may just quickly, I fully agree with you on the issue of repurposing subsidies. It wasn't to advocate for that necessarily as an answer, but it's certainly to advocate that we would need international cooperation around how we think about doing the repurposing of subsidies, because there will be equally as much concern about the repurposed subsidies as the environmental harmful subsidies, particularly from a trade and development viewpoint. So I think there's a lot more work to be done. And in fact, we probably need a broader subsidies discussion that recognizes both aspects of this, because I think, as Ambassador Baxter said earlier, we all know agricultural reform has been hugely politically complicated for any country and is complicated everywhere. So the domestic political economy of it is likely to be, in some countries, there will be a push towards repurposing rather than taking them away altogether, for better or for worse. And countries will have to manage their own trade-offs. Like, would they rather spend it on agriculture or on food systems or on the health system? It's public money. And that will be a domestic debate to be had as well. So that's, I think, all I can add. Thanks.
Thanks. That's great. Antonin, maybe you might have some thoughts.
Thank you very much. Very interesting questions. I'm not sure I have the answers to all, but few elements of reflections. The more simple one, clarification on the figure. This is the total amount of agricultural support or market price support. Couple subsidies to output, couple subsidies to the use of inputs, plus other types of support. So that's the total amount that I've shown in these figures, divided by the total cropland that is harvested in the country. So this is a way to standardize and compare countries to get a sense of the intensity of the agricultural support. The question on the negative support and how to repurpose or reform this, if I understood correctly, that's a really good one. Without being too complicated, I think we could say governments that are taxing their agricultural sector, if you remove this tax, the incentive will be the opposite. So farmers could be incentivized to produce more. You could say this will have a likely higher impact on biodiversity, but this is not what is shown in these graphics, right? Because here I've shown correlations, and there is a positive correlations. The higher the agricultural support per hectare, the higher the number or the share of species threatened by agriculture. That was the result, the main result I tried to show. But this is coming from a correlation, not causal. So if you take one country over time, this is a photo of several countries taken at the same time. There is a methodological issue there. Not sure the effect would be would be the one indicated, suggested by this graph, but we could expect to have more incentives to produce more. So likely effect on biodiversity could be worse, actually. Kind of the opposite of these graphs are suggesting, but because of method, depends whether you take a photo or you take a movie of one country over time. I really agree with what Caroline has said. I think what is important is practices, agricultural practices. And I think there is a high dependence on the context. I'm working in another project in several African countries, including Ethiopia, actually. And we see that the pressures on biodiversity coming from the agricultural sector are roughly of two types. Either the spatial expansion of the agricultural sector at the expense of natural habitats. That is, agriculture is eating a little bit of ecosystems, or excessive use of chemical inputs that are contributing to pollution that impacts ultimately biodiversity. You can have these two different types of pressure. You want to address them by different reforms of existing types of agricultural support. So it can be, I think in most cases will be country dependent, even within a single country, depending on the specific practice that is impacting biodiversity, the answer, the response can be different. Thank you.
Just before you finish, just quickly, did you have any thoughts on the question about ranking in terms of impact?
I think the two keywords to answer this are in your presentation, Martin, trade-offs and synergies. And I think Caroline mentioned them already. So I think there are trade-offs. I think there are synergies. It's difficult in absolute terms, ex ante, a priori, to say rank number one is this one. Again, I think it will depend on on correlated emissions. If you want to rank one type of agricultural support according to its broad effect on several sustainability dimensions, will be very hard. So there are trade-offs. Unfortunately, it's not that simple, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Martin, in addition to the questions that were specifically directed at you, anything you'd like to contribute on any of the questions asked, please?
Sure, thanks very much. No, really good questions. Maybe just going a bit in order. So I don't have much to add to the ranking question. I do think actually that it's really important to look at not only the trade-offs and synergies, but also at the local specificities. I mean, essentially you're talking about environmental scarcities which differ across countries. And so the pressures on specific environmental goods differ depending on the abundance of that good. And that's, I think, something that we always have to bear in mind. Ron, the other question that you had on kind of, how much support does a sector actually need? I think this is a really good one. And I think what we ultimately should really look at is how do we efficiently use public money? That's at the end of the day, because the policies are supposed to basically spend the money in order to achieve social goods, right? To achieve something for the society. And that's basically, in the end, whether that's in agriculture and fisheries or in a different sector, is not necessarily an answer that is given by the amount of money that currently goes into those sectors. So that's probably something to be said importantly there as well. On the negative support question, that's a really good one. First, it really depends on the countries. Different countries have negative support for different reasons. If you just compare Argentina with India, in the former case, you basically have export taxes that basically prevent domestic products from going efficiently to the international markets, and therefore the domestic price is lower. There, of course, the reform idea would be relatively simple, but the effects that you already mentioned are there. I mean, essentially, you're increasing domestic price, and therefore you're increasing incentives to produce. In India, the situation is much more complex because the policy setting in India are much more complex, right? You have basically a system of policies that is both national and state level. and you have trade frictions and different regulations across the whole country. And so I think looking at how to reform that is a much more complex question and probably requires a much more detailed analysis, certainly more detailed than what I can do in those couple of minutes now. So, but I think it's really important to also say that there is, of course, and again, an efficiency question there. If farmers basically don't receive the rewards for the products they produce that they ought to have, then you have an allocation problem there again. It's just the opposite direction. So it's something we also equally need to bear in mind. Yeah, on the question of practices, that is actually something we're looking into right now. So we're trying to also provide a bit more details in our database in terms of what kind of practices, what kind of conditionalities are actually supported or disincentivized, which is quite important. At the moment, this item of our database is relatively coarse, and so it's very hard for me to go into details in terms of providing an answer. But this is really something that our delegations also have realized it's a really important issue that we need to work on. So we'll work towards really providing more details, which then actually allows us or will allow us to provide an answer not only for a specific country where you may have details already now, but across the countries and make things comparable also, so that countries actually are in the position to learn from each other as well. So that's I think quite important. I think I'll leave it there. That's okay.
Malaku, anything you'd like to say on any of the questions?
No, I think a lot of them have been answered very well. I was going to comment on the repurposing concept, but it has been dealt with properly, and I agree with all that. I was fascinated by the question, maybe a comment about the experiment of rewriting the agriculture agreement. And without having the text of the agreement in front of me, I was engaging in my own thoughts, and I said, would there be anything I would keep in the agriculture agreement that we have now, except probably the preamble, where it talks about the need to establish a fair and market-oriented trading system. That's the only thing I would keep probably. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And anything else from you at this stage, Carolyn? I think we've got time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions if anyone has anything further.
Bob Wolf from Queen's University in Canada. Fascinating panel. I've learned a lot from all the speakers. Ambassador Kelly probably nailed it at the outset. This is good for you to do for yourself, right? You shouldn't, international disciplines are probably not the way you're going to get there. Mr. Van Lemp, I think, just gave an excellent justification for OECD work. We're providing the information, we're showing you where the trade-offs might be, gives you some inducement maybe to do it for yourself. That part is clear, and the more information that can be made available. So the question for Carolyn is, really, you had a very interesting idea about how the fisheries agreement looked at practices, not the form of subsidy. And yet, let us be honest, 25 years of work on the fisheries agreement, and Fish 1 isn't in force yet. And we wonder if Fish 2 will even be signed. And in those cases, the issue has been, it's hard for trade negotiators to get their heads around a harm to fish as opposed to a harm to a trading partner. And in the case of what's going on with the fascinating subsidies we've been talking about today, the harm to all of us as citizens is clear. Is there harm to trade in a way that trade negotiators could get their heads around? And that would be the really important question, because otherwise this house can't do anything with it, I don't think. And certainly trying to open the agricultural agreement would be, just for this, would be a very interesting exercise in frustration, I would have thought.
Thank you. All right, we might draw a line under that one. Carolyn, did you have any thoughts?
So I come to the panel as an optimist about all things, and the importance of trying. So I do think, we're faced with some fairly fundamental environmental crises, and we need to try and work out how we can align this trading system in a way that we can address them collectively. So having said that, I'm also not naive. I mean, I recognize that it's been a long time. I worked on fish as my first ever job, 30 years ago. So it's been a long time. But I think that members have found solutions to some of those issues. I mean, Fish 1 will enter into force. Fish 2 will be complicated, but they have shown that they are willing to have a negotiation based on an environmental harm and not a trade-based one. I mean, that's a huge evolution. I'm not saying it's, will remain to be seen in its implementation how much environmental benefit ultimately is generated from that, but they have shown the flexibility to look at an environmental harm. Having said that, I would say it's going to be quite complicated in the agricultural sense, because I mean, even with fish, we're talking about global public, a global commons in a way. And the challenge with some of the agricultural environmental harms, they will be felt very much nationally. Some of them will be felt globally, like climate. It contributes to a global problem. Some of them, if you want to pollute your backyard endlessly, I mean, it's really for your citizenry to vote you out and say this is not helping us in the long run, because we're undermining our resource base or our ecosystems, whatever. But I don't think that we have to have a harm to trade in order to discuss it in this house. I think we need to have an issue that requires trade-related cooperation to solve. And that will be because we're talking about international supply chains and trading relationships that can be part of driving, unsustainable practices, or, not in, or countries can't fix them alone. So I think that we have to try, and I think that among many of the government delegations that I speak with here, there's a strong recognition that we have to put sustainability issues much more centrally in the work of the organization, to do so in a way that's fair, to do so in a way that recognizes the economic and social issues. But I don't see many governments here running away from that as a reality, and especially because so many of them are facing so many environmental impacts that harm their production and that harm their trade. So I think we're beyond. That's my assessment.
Thank you. Did anyone else on the panel have any comments to make on that one? Look, I think I might, in view of the time, then.
Yeah, excuse me, and thanks very much. Just very briefly on this cooperation thing, and I very much share the view of Caroline on the need to collaborate. And I think we at the OECD have a slightly different role from WTO. We're not negotiating treaties, but we're talking to each other in order to find kind of common sense as well. And I think that's probably very complementary to each other. The way that we work is really try to learn from each other and to try to see what can we achieve if we act together, as opposed to each of us individually. You're right. The efficiency thing is something that you want to look at your home, but there is things that you need to look at beyond your own border. And so I think this kind of collaboration / negotiation aspect is quite important. And if there's different organizations that basically work on that from different angles, I think that can be only helpful.
Sorry, I just realized I didn't respond to the second part of your question, Robert, which was that would it not be also good to look at the trade impacts? And I think it would indeed. We need to identify the environmentally harmful part of it. If we can also map on top of that it's also trade distorting and damaging in that way, that's it sort of gets a double red mark, right? And even more reason to act on those as a priority. Because I think in starting anything on this in the WTO, we're going to have to find a wedge in that is something that is quite not seriously narrow, but a specific way in. And it will be probably looking at the most environmentally harmful and the most trade distortive, I guess. But I think we need to do the environmental analysis in its own right first to see what's really there, and not to mix it too much. Thank you.
Very last comment. Wanted to highlight the Kunming-Montréal Global Biodiversity Framework, Target 18. I think it provides us a legal basis. I mean, many WTO members are also parties to the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and they approved the Kunming-Montréal GBF Target 18, which exactly says this. So starting with the most harmful incentives, I would say we could identify incentives that are simultaneously trade distorting and the most harmful to biodiversity or the environment. And yeah, that's quite new. Let's start from here, maybe. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a really valuable discussion from my viewpoint. I think the panelists have highlighted a number of aspects here, and the discussion has drawn out some of the aspects of the issue that we will have to deal with. I think just picking up on that last part of the conversation, obviously what we need to do in those of us who are in the WTO is identify the contribution that global trade rules can make to the interests of members more broadly. And from Australia's point of view, that's what the government is expecting us to do here. And that is something that we are committed to working with others to taking forward. This is one element of a much broader suite of issues where I think, as Carolyn mentioned, we've seen that happening. I think some of the aspects, I won't try to sum up the discussion, but some of the aspects of the issue that we've heard come out this afternoon is that while some work has been undertaken, more needs to be done. We really are still grappling with the nature of the issue, the intersection of the issue with trade rules, and then how the issue fits more broadly into that sustainability question. We've also heard about the multifaceted nature of the issue in terms of geographical scope. So the juxtaposition, I think, of the importance of looking at specific contexts, geographical, national, local contexts, and then the global impact of some of the work, of some of the government spending here. And then also the context within governments, within nations, about how spending on some of these programs might be prioritized compared with spending on other government priorities. Then, as I mentioned, we've heard about, in particular from Malako, about I think about the broader sustainability debate that this is taking place. That's the context for this discussion, and that we're not, and then we've heard more broadly that there are intersections of this issue with other challenges that we're facing, including long-standing challenges in the WTO in areas like food security and how that can be addressed through the reform of agricultural trade rules. I suppose for me, for Australia, the key point is that while there is need for and the capacity for domestic action, we will not be as effective because of the nature of the problem that we're facing if governments don't work together. There will be a limit on what we can achieve environmentally, but there will also likely be an increase in political differences. And that's going to be on top of, that will just make the task of reforming agricultural trade and production rules even harder. So what we need to do from Australia's point of view is build on this discussion, build up a commitment to tackling this problem cooperatively. Through research, through analysis, we need much more of that, but also through discussion. And we want that discussion to be a cooperative one that starts from the ground floor with all members as part of it, so that it can develop in a way that is most likely to lead to consensus and avoid some of the problems that we've faced in the Article 20 ag reform discussions, which of course must continue in parallel. With that, I'd like to thank you all for participating, and in particular to thank the panelists for really, I think, just bringing to light a whole range of issues and showing their relevance to governments and communities across the world, and I think highlighting the need for us to be paying much greater attention to it. So thank you.